everybody. How y'all doing this week? We are rapidly getting to the end of this course. There's not a lot, well, there is a bit to do this week, but it's mostly like reading and perusing, and I'll kind of show you what I mean by that. All right, so this week, like I said, we're doing climate change. So I want to talk about your discussion for this week because it's going to require 2 days of your life that you can't really get back. All right, so okay, so the first thing we're going to peruse is this climate change stuff. Now, I don't have any specific questions, quiz questions, things like that, but this idea about climate change and how we read and interpret graphs and charts is on your final exam. So I'm kind of putting it here, and it's on the honor system that you will peruse it. So looking at a graph such as this one, how do we know that the climate is changing? This is looking at carbon dioxide levels, and you can see this is where it was in 1950, and this is where it is now. Well, it looks like things, at least the carbon dioxide level is going up, right? And so it explains what's going on. And so ideally you would, look at these things, read, just superficially, read over it, make sure you understand it. Here's some evidence that the climate is changing. And so, there's more in here if you wanted to read about shrinking ice sheets, but understanding that some of the indicators of rapid climate change are a global temperature rise, a warming ocean, shrinking ice sheets, the glaciers are retreating, decrease in the amount of snow on the planet, the rise in sea level, the decline in sea ice, extreme events, which we talked about last week, the ocean turning to acid, which is a logical fallacy, but it still is. It's becoming more acidic, but it's still on the basic side, right? So that's kind of what, so maybe you jot that stuff down. You can take notes. I'm not collecting them. I'm not looking at them, but you need to know what some of the indicators of rapid climate change are. Okay, so that's what this page is about. Okay, so all right, then there's the frequently asked questions. This is more of a how do you know, blah, blah, blah. So these are ones that you could click on any of, how does global warming affect your health and well-being? So these are more like a curiosity type thing. But it's all here. Again, weird charts and graphs. This one I don't pay attention to. So this one talks about how they're going to predict it, blah, blah, blah. So just kind of, again, you're going to do some, what I like to call collegiate reading. And what that means is you just want to kind of go, okay, yeah, I get it. And kind of just pack it in there. Because it's more of just like an idea factory is what we're looking at this week. So you want to pay attention to things like, how do we know? What can we do? Because one of the things is about, solutions and stuff like that. And just kind of, give it the old college try in reading through it. Again, you can take notes if something catches your eye. But, this is a good one. Why does solar radiation play in determining Earth climate change? So that one's a good one. All right, the next one is the Lumen Learning one, and you're not clicking next on any of these, so you're just going to read whatever is on that page. So this is talking about how the climate has changed in for the last 10,000, 2,000 years. So this is over time. So throughout Earth's history, what have things looked like? So I'm sure you're aware we've had ice ages in the past, and then there were warming periods. And so this is going to talk about what they mean by an ice age, what they mean by a warming period, like how much temperature change in the past we're talking about. And then you can kind of look at that in context to how much the temperature has changed in the last 2,000 years, right? And then this one is on short-term climate changes, which is El Nino and La Nina. So El Nino is when the ocean gets a little too warm in the Pacific. We get a lot of rain which is unseasonable for us. We're not really supposed to be really wet. We're a Mediterranean climate. So, and then there are dry places that normally would get wet. And so they call it the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so this right here is talking about El Nino, and La Nina is the opposite. It's when we get really, really, really dry. So when the temperature of the ocean gets cool, then we get what's called a La Nina, remembering and tying that back into the idea that cold air does not hold a lot of moisture. So if the ocean's really cool, it's not evaporating a lot of moisture into the clouds. Those clouds aren't able to bring the moisture to us, right? And if the moisture doesn't come to us, then we don't have a Mediterranean climate either. I was just recently, I went to a thing, or I don't know what I was doing, but we were talking about at what point do we redefine what the climate is in a particular place. If climate is the, over 10 years or over 100 years, what the weather has been like what, taking all of the weather and, averaging it over 10 years, at what point do we say we're no longer in a Mediterranean climate and that California is not in a drought, it's just now in a semi-arid region, right? At what point do we start redefining the climate on the planet so that it's better reflective of what's actually been happening over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? But that was an interesting idea that I just thought I'd bring up. This is a cool video. This is also a cool video. So if you don't know much about El Nino and La Nina, take a look at both of these videos. They're really great at explaining what they are and how they work. And again, you may find some questions about El Nino and La Nina. It should have also been in the chapter, I think it's in the extreme weather chapter from last week. You might have read about El Nino and La Nina, but I could be wrong. It could have been before that. All right. Then they're talking about causes of long-term climate change. And so you might want to look at these. These are more kind of like theoretical. These are some of the reasons why people say, oh, well, it's not really us that's causing climate change, it's sunspots. And it's a natural process, and so you may want to, jot down some of the long-term climate change things and kind of understand what those are. And then the last one is anthropogenic climate change. That means us. Anthro means human. And so this is talking about, again, this kind of goes back to the first one where it talks about, what are the indicators that the climate is changing. And this is talking more about how us as humans have kind of led to these particular changes in climate. So again, just, there's some videos in here and some cool stuff like that. And this video, sorry, I don't think works anymore. Yeah, the person took their copyright back. So but it's Lumen Learning. I'm not in charge of that website, so I don't have to worry about that link. So don't worry about that video. All right. And then these are kind of, they're still timely, but they are, they're going on almost 10 years old. But there's some good stuff in here. I particularly like this one, which talks about the impacts in various places. So I've always said that climate change is only a problem if you care where you live. If you can migrate and move somewhere, then go there, go to a more suitable climate, right? But this is talking more about how various places, particularly low income, low, like poverty-stricken countries are impacted more by climate change than us more developed places. Because like I said, if we wanted to, we could get in our cars and drive to a climate that is more suitable to us, if we so choose. If you are living in a fairly indigenous lifestyle, then there's no like mobility, then you're kind of stuck with whatever you got. So this last video kind of talks about some of the impacts that these climate changes have had on various, places in the world. So, all right. this is the TED Talk I want to talk about, why climate change is a threat to human rights. So we'll watch it together, and then we'll have a little bit of, like, discussion afterwards, ideally. Just somebody, give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. All right. Oh, look, commercial. All right, perfect. Okay.
A question I'm often asked is, where did I get my passion for human rights and justice? It started early. I grew up in the west of Ireland, wedged between 4 brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger than me. So of course I had to be interested in human rights and equality and justice and using my elbows. And those issues stayed with me and guided me. And in particular, when I was elected the first woman president of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, I dedicated my presidency to having a space for those who felt marginalised on the island of Ireland and bringing together communities from Northern Ireland with those from the Republic, trying to build a peace. And I went as the first Irish president to the United Kingdom and met with Queen Elizabeth II, and also welcomed to my official residence, which we call Oras an Uachtaráin, the house of the president, members of the royal family, including notably the Prince of Wales. And I was aware that at the time of my presidency, Ireland was a country beginning a rapid economic progress. We were a country that was benefiting from the solidarity of the European Union. Indeed, when Ireland first joined the European Union in 1973, there were parts of the country that were considered developing, including my own beloved native County Mayo. I led trade delegations here to the United States, to Japan, to India, to encourage investment, to help to create jobs, to build up our economy, to build up our health system, our education, our development. What I didn't have to do as president was buy land on mainland Europe so that Irish citizens could go there because our island was going underwater. What I didn't have to think about either as president or as a constitutional lawyer was the implications for the sovereignty of the territory because of the impact of climate change. But that is what President Tong of the Republic of Kiribati has to wake up every morning thinking about. He has bought land in Fiji as an insurance policy, what he calls migration with dignity, because he knows that his people may have to leave their islands. As I listened to President Tong describing the situation, I really felt that this was a problem that no leader should have to face. And as I heard him speak about the pain of his problems, I thought about Eleanor Roosevelt. I thought about her and those who worked with her on the Commission on Human Rights, which she chaired in 1948, and drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For them, it would have been unimaginable that a whole country could go out of existence because of human-induced climate change. I came to climate change not as a scientist or an environmental lawyer, and I wasn't really impressed by the images of polar bears or melting glaciers. It was because of the impact on people and the impact on their rights to food and safe water, health, education, and shelter. And I say this with humility because I came late to the issue of climate change. When I served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, climate change wasn't front of my mind. I don't remember making a single speech on climate change. I knew that there was another part of the United Nations, the UN Convention on Climate Change, that was dealing with the issue of climate change. It was later, when I started to work in African countries on issues of development and human rights. And I kept hearing this pervasive sentence, "Oh, but things are so much worse now. Things are so much worse." And when I explored what was behind that, it was about changes in the climate shocks, changes in the weather. I met Constance O'Kellett, who had formed a women's group in eastern Uganda. And she told me that when she was growing up, she had a very normal life in her village and they didn't go hungry. They knew that the seasons would come as they were predicted to come. They knew when to sow and they knew when to harvest. And so they had enough food. But in recent years, at the time of this conversation, they had nothing but long periods of drought and then flash flooding and then more drought. The school had been destroyed. Livelihoods had been destroyed. Their harvest had been destroyed. She formed this women's group to try to keep her community together. And this was a reality that really struck me because, of course, Constance O'Kellett wasn't responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that were causing this problem. Indeed, I was very struck about the situation in Malawi in January of this year. There was an unprecedented flooding in the country. It covered about a third of the country. Over 300 people were killed and hundreds of thousands lost their livelihoods. And the average person in Malawi emits about 80 kilograms of CO2 a year. The average US citizen emits about 17.5 metric tons. So those who are suffering disproportionately don't drive cars, don't have electricity, don't consume very significantly, and yet they are feeling more and more the impacts of the changes in the climate, the changes that are preventing them from knowing how to grow food properly and knowing how to look after their future. And I think it was really the importance of the injustice that really struck me very forcibly. And I know that we're not able to address some of that injustice because we're not on course for a safe world. Governments around the world agreed at the conference in Copenhagen and have repeated it at every conference on climate, that we have to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial standards. But we're on course for about 4 degrees. So we face an existential threat to the future of our planet. And that made me realize that climate change is the greatest threat to human rights in the 21st century. And that brought me then to climate justice. Climate justice responds to the moral argument, both sides of the moral argument, to address climate change. First of all, to be on the side of those who are suffering most and are most affected. And secondly, to make sure that they're not left behind again when we start to move and start to address climate change with climate action, as we are doing. In our very unequal world today, it's very striking how many people are left behind. In our world of 7.2 billion people, about 3 billion are left behind. 1.3 billion don't have access to electricity, and they light their homes with kerosene and candles, both of which are dangerous. And in fact, they spend a lot of their tiny income on that form of lighting. 2.6 billion people cook on open fires, on coal, wood, and animal dung. And this causes about 4 million deaths a year from indoor smoke inhalation. And of course, most of those who die are women. So we have a very unequal world. And we need to change from business as usual. And we shouldn't underestimate the scale and the transformative nature of the change which will be needed, because we have to go to zero carbon emissions by about 2050 if we're going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And that means that we have to leave about 2/3 of the known resources of fossil fuels in the ground. It's a very big change, and it means that obviously industrialized countries must cut their emissions, must become much more energy efficient, and must move as quickly as possible to renewable energy. For developing countries and emerging economies, the problem and the challenge is to grow without emissions, because they must develop. They have very poor populations. So they must develop without emissions. And that is a different kind of problem. Indeed, no country in the world has actually grown without emissions. All the countries have developed with fossil fuel and then maybe moving to renewable energy. So it is a very big challenge, and it requires the total support of the international community with the necessary finance and technology and systems and support, because no country can make itself safe from the dangers of climate change. This is an issue that requires complete human solidarity. Human solidarity, if you like, based on self-interest, because we are all in this together, and we have to work together to ensure that we reach the zero carbon by 2050. The good news is that change is happening, and it's happening very fast. Here in California, there's a very ambitious emissions target to cut emissions. In Hawaii, they're passing legislation to have 100% renewable energy by 2045. And governments are very ambitious around the world. In Costa Rica, they have committed to be carbon neutral by 2021. In Ethiopia, the commitment is to be carbon neutral by 2027. Apple have pledged that their factories in China will use renewable energy. And there is a race on at the moment to convert electricity from tidal and wave power in order that we can leave the coal in the ground. And that change is both welcome and is happening very rapidly, but it's still not enough, and the political will is still not enough. Let me come back to President Tong and his people in Kiribati. They actually could be able to live on their island and have a solution, but it would take a lot of political will. President Tong told me about his ambitious idea to either build up or even float the little islands where his people live. This, of course, is beyond the resources of Kiribati itself. It would require great solidarity and support from other countries, and it would require the kind of imaginative idea that we bring together when we want to have a space station in the air. But wouldn't it be wonderful to have this engineering wonder and to allow a people to remain in their sovereign territory and to be part of the community of nations? That is the kind of idea that we should be thinking about. Yes, the challenges of the transformation we need are big, but they can be solved. We are actually, as a people, very capable of coming together to solve problems. I was very conscious of this as I took part this year in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in 1945. 1945 was an extraordinary year. It was a year when the world faced what must have seemed almost insoluble problems. The devastation of the world wars, particularly the Second World War, the fragile peace that had been brought about, the need for a whole economic regeneration. But the leaders at that time didn't flinch from this. They had the capacity, they had a sense of being driven by never again must the world have this kind of problem. And they had to build structures for peace and security. And what did we get? What did they achieve? The Charter of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, as they're called, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, a Marshall Plan for Europe, a devastated Europe, to reconstruct it, and indeed, a few years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 2015 is a year that is similar in its importance to 1945, with similar challenges and similar potential. There will be two big summits this year. The first one in September in New York is the summit for the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the summit in Paris in December to give us a climate agreement. The Sustainable Development Goals are intended to help countries to live sustainably in tune with Mother Earth, not to take out of Mother Earth and destroy ecosystems, but rather to live in harmony with Mother Earth by living under sustainable development. And the Sustainable Development Goals will come into operation for all countries on the 1st of January 2016. The climate agreement, a binding climate agreement, is needed because of the scientific evidence that we're on a trajectory for about a 4-degree world, and we have to change course to stay below 2 degrees. So we need to take steps that will be monitored and reviewed so that we can keep increasing the ambition of how we cut emissions and how we move more rapidly to renewable energy so that we have a safe world. The reality is that this issue is much too important to be left to politicians and to the United Nations. It's an issue for all of us, and it's an issue where we need more and more momentum. Indeed, the face of the environmentalist has changed because of the justice dimension. It's now an issue for faith-based organizations under very good leadership from Pope Francis, and indeed the Church of England, which is divesting from fossil fuels. It's an issue for the business community. And the good news is that the business community is changing very rapidly, except for the fossil fuel industries. Even they are beginning to slightly change their language, but only slightly. But business is not only moving rapidly to the benefits of renewable energy, but is urging politicians to give them more signals so they can move even more rapidly. It's an issue for the trade union movement. It's an issue for the women's movement. It's an issue for young people. I was very struck when I learned that Zibril Kazan, one of the Greensboro Four, who had taken part in the Woolworth sit-ins, said quite recently that climate change is the lunch counter moment for young people. So lunch counter moment for young people of the 21st century, the sort of real human rights issue of the 21st century, because he said it is the greatest challenge to humanity and justice in our world. I recall very much the climate march last September, and that was a huge momentum, not just in New York, but all around the world, and we have to build on that. I was marching with some of the elders' family, and I saw a placard a little bit away from me, but we were wedged so closely together because, after all, there were 400,000 people out on the streets of New York. So I couldn't quite get to that placard. I would have just liked to have been able to step behind it because it said, "Angry Grannies." And that's what I felt. And I have 5 grandchildren now. I feel very happy as an Irish grandmother to have 5 grandchildren. And I think about their world and what it will be like when they will share that world with about 9 billion other people in 2050. We know that inevitably it will be a climate-constrained world because of the emissions we have already put up there. But it could be a world that is much more equal and much fairer and much better for health and better for jobs and better for energy security than the world we have now, if we have switched sufficiently and early enough to renewable energy, and no one is left behind. No one is left behind. And just as we've been looking back, this year in 2015 to 1945, looking back 70 years, I would like to think that they will look back, that world will look back 35 years from 2050, 35 years to 2015, and that they will say, weren't they good to do what they did in 2015? We really appreciate that they took the decisions that made a difference and that put the world on the right pathway, and we benefit now from that pathway, that they will feel that somehow we took our responsibilities. We did what was done in 1945 in similar terms. We didn't miss the opportunity. We lived up to our responsibilities. That's what this year is about. And somehow for me, it's captured in words of somebody that I admired very much. She was a mentor of mine. She was a friend. She died much too young. She was an extraordinary personality, a great champion of the environment, Wangari Maathai. Wangari said once, in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to switch to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground. And that's what we have to do. We have to reach a new level of consciousness, a higher moral ground. And we have to do it this year in those two big summits. And that won't happen unless we have the momentum from people around the world who say, we want action now, we want to change course, we want a safe world for future generations, a safe world for our children and our grandchildren, and we're all in this together. Thank you. Okay.
All right. So, what'd you think?